Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I cannot be there. I wish I could be there for this conference, but unfortunately, it's at the same time as the International Revitalization, National Conference Revitalization of Indigenous and Minoritized Languages here in Girona. So I can't be at both places at the same time, but I wish I can be there for the next time. So I just recorded the presentation for you, and we can just chat and see what you think about it, and you can just send me an email if you want to talk about this. But this is my presentation. Ûnfatsoenlik, Ideologies of Politeness and Linguistic minorization in a Globalized World. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the work that we did. Some of you maybe watching this presentation were working with me, so this may be familiar to some of you. There are some workshops that we did on linguistic assertiveness and linguistic minorization in Frisian about 3 years ago, which it's hard to believe, but it's already 3 years. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge Sarapinho and Sidifan Bofen, both of whom work with me on other projects that led to this project on new speakers of Frisian, and with Sarapinho we also worked on intelligibility between Frisian and Dutch. And so I wanted to acknowledge both of them and everyone at the University of Groningen in Minorities and Multilingualism, all the professors that we had there, because they also helped shape almost everything that that I will be saying today. Also acknowledgements to Miguel Fellinger, who helped a lot from AFUC. So this project actually was a collaboration between AFUC and the University of Groningen, the Department of Minorities and Multilingualism. So Miguel Fellinger and Jensma worked together with me to design this workshops, and Gerrit de Jong, who helped with all the translations into Frisian, and basically supervised all the Frisian translations, both for the project, for the materials that we gave the participants, and also later on the quotes that I was working on, and she helped me supervise those translations as well. So I wanted to say thank you to everyone. And so we'll start with a simple question. So what happens when you start a conversation? And that's like normally most people have all these questions of like, will I be understood, or what happens if I'm not understood? Well, I mean, if you speak a dominant language, if you speak, if you're in the Netherlands, if you're in Amsterdam, and you start, well, maybe not in Amsterdam, because if you do start a conversation in Amsterdam in Dutch, you may also have these questions here. Maybe the person you're speaking to always speaks English, right? So in certain situations, you have this, all these questions, all these doubts of, will I be understood? What happens if I'm not understood, right? Because some people may be aggressive if they hear that you're addressing them in a language that it's not what they would expect. And so how can I avoid all this stress? And a lot of people, to avoid this stress, just directly start conversations in the dominant language, because you just, and so the pressure to adapt is always on us, so speakers of minoritized languages. And if you don't adapt, that's seen as a face-threatening act. So it's your politeness, basically, a face-threatening act, an impolite act that you do. And so if you have this meme here on the, I don't know if it's on the right or the left of your screen, but you can see here. So if you're a speaker of a minoritized language, and you have all these things, you have minorization, politeness, discrimination that are there, like lurking behind you, and then you start a conversation with someone, your interlocutor, and then they reply to you, just speak normal to me, right? So you have to switch to the dominant language, and that it helps and contributes to everything that was there already lurking behind you. So being a speaker of a minoritized language, it's often very tiring, actually. It's exhausting because you have all this always happening, and you're always questioning your language use, where and when and with whom you can use what languages, right? And of course, that's minoritized languages, all of them, any kind of minoritized language. And so basically, to avoid stress, you can decide to just use the dominant language, and a lot of people do that. And so when you don't know the other person, or you assume the other person is from a different group or does not speak your language, you use the dominant language. And then accommodation is often just seen as an act of politeness. So you accommodate to the dominant language, and that's seen as polite. You're being respectful. It's a strategy to save face, both your own face, so so that you don't get discriminated against, or so that the other person does not become maybe aggressive towards you, but also to save the other person's face. So the other person doesn't have to accommodate. They don't have to change anything. They can just be themselves, right? And so you are both saving your face and their face, positive and negative face. But accommodation does add to minorization. It contributes to the process of minorization because it diminishes the social use of the language. That's like the first thing. Of course, if we all just use the dominant language because we accommodate the dominant language because of respect or politeness or whatever, then we use it less. And if we use it less, then people hear it less, and well, it contributes to the whole minorization cycle. And it also alienates new speakers. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation, but so it does have an effect on people who want to learn the language, or who have learned the language, but maybe don't speak it as fluently, or don't sound quote unquote native, and it alienates them. And there are studies that have shown that. And in addition, it is minorization that makes us switch to the dominant language, but very often our decision of who we switch with is based on racialization and othering. So this thing of when we assume that the other person does not speak the language, then we switch to the dominant language. And when do we assume that? So often when the other person does not look like what we would expect a person of our in-group to look like, right? And there are studies in Catalan that show that, or in the context of Catalan that show that very often, if you have a different color of skin or different facial features or whatnot, you're more often than not addressed to in Spanish, in this case, in the dominant language. And so this is a problem not just for speakers of minoritized languages. It also contributes to the minorization, to the racialization, to the othering of the groups, right? So it's not just a problem for speakers of minoritized languages; it's a problem for everyone. So it is really something that we need to work on. And so Swayan Fahines in 2010 proposed this thing that they call linguistic assertiveness. And they, in order to stop this cycle of minorization that we're talking about, and linguistic assertiveness, it consists on using your own language to start all communicative interactions, to continue using it until your interlocutor asks you to accommodate, and I put politely here because if they're rude, maybe you don't want to. And also knowing and accepting that accommodation is just not an obligation, it's your decision. So it's up to you. You don't have to accommodate, it's up to you. And you can make the decision freely. And they talk about this, and they ask this is in their book, which is called Consulta de l'armario linguistic, which is kind of like how to get out of the closet, the linguistic closet. But it's a guide to live speaking Catalan in the Catalan speaking area. And they ask this question to the readers: when do we switch to the dominant language? And they talk about these 6 cases. Maybe when we already start right away in the dominant language, or maybe if we think that our interlocutor does not understand us, or if our interlocutor is not quote unquote a native speaker of the minoritized language, or if they do not speak the minoritized language, or if they tell us that they don't understand the minoritized language, or if they ask us to switch to the dominant language. And so this sounds very similar, but if you take a look at these 6 situations, you will see they are actually different. And so they talk about these 6 situations and they say, okay, the last 2, this is normal, right? So if your interlocutor outright says, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying, or if they say, I'm sorry, can you change? Then that's normal, we change. But changing right away, or changing because we think they don't understand, but they haven't said anything, or changing because we think they're not native speakers, or changing because they don't speak it, which is different from understanding it. This is not necessarily normal. This is not a situation in which a speaker of a dominant language, in which a speaker of a dominant language, would switch, right? And so that's something to think about, why we change in these situations. And I have this quote here because, well, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the context of Frisian and Friesland because this is a conference on Frisian Humanities, so I'm assuming that everyone knows that, and probably much better than I do. So I'm not going to talk about that. So you all know the context where this is coming from. And this is a quote from another study that one of the studies that kind of led and shaped a little bit what I'm going to be presenting now. And so this is a quote from a participant. It's a study that we did on the motivation of learners of Frisian. So why they learn Frisian. And we had this participant saying, I really want to learn Frisian. Right? Ik wil dat graag, maar het is moeilijk, right? But it's difficult because the Frisians often switch to Dutch when I speak with them. So this was not just one participant, this came over and over again. So there was a problem with this thing that we said about alienating new speakers. And so we identified this problem and we said, okay, so this is a problem for people who want to learn the language. People do it kind of unconsciously, and it's not really their fault that they do it. They just, minorization makes us do it. We're kind of like ingrained already in our minds, and we have been told so often that we have to change that we just do it. And so how can we talk about it? How can we work on it? And so we came up with this ervaringen met vertalige conversaties project. So experiences with 2 languages, which is already bilingual, that's Frisian. And the idea was to run a series of workshops. And I know that right now there's work on linguistic assertiveness in places in Europe, and I know, or think rather, because of COVID, I'm a bit disconnected, but I think there is work actually being done in Friesland, so further work. But this was kind of like a pilot project that we did. And the idea was to do it bigger, but I got accepted to do my PhD in Santa Barbara, so we had to cut it short so I could move to the States. But we did 2 workshops actually. So between April and May 2019, we did 2 workshops. It was 2 hours, one in Leeuwarden and one in Franeker, if I'm not mistaken. And we had 15 participants in total. 13 of them were Frisian speakers. One of them also spoke Stadfries. I think Franegers was it. One Bills speaker who reported not speaking Frisian, but speaking Bills, and one Dutch speaker. And by this, I mean all of them spoke Dutch, of course, but I mean one Dutch speaker who did not speak either Frisian or Bills or any Stadfries, or did not report to speak any of those. And so one of the shortcomings of this is that we were not able to include more quote unquote monolingual Dutch speakers. So Dutch speakers who do not speak any of the minoritized varieties of the area. And that's a shortcoming. We wanted to include more of them, but again, because we had to cut it short, we couldn't. And so we kind of, we're reading this more as an experience for speakers to kind of like to empower them to use the language rather than to try and educate the dominant language speakers to accept this new situation, right? Although this would be also very interesting, and I would definitely love to do something like that, because I do think that some of our efforts have to be addressed or directed towards this group as well. So we have workshops and we had surveys, both before the workshop and after the workshop. And I'm going to present some quotes here from participants from the surveys, because the surveys included some open-ended questions. And I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with both Frisian and Dutch, but I will be presenting the quotes. Those that are in Frisian will appear in blue, and those that are in Dutch will appear in red. So you can see also the choice of language for those of you who may not know, but I'm assuming all of you will. So the structure of the workshops, we started with an introduction. There was a pre-workshop survey, and then we had a discussion between about the relationship between the participants and their mother tongue. And so we asked them how they felt for their mother tongue. We asked them, when do you switch them in a language, and how does it make you feel? And me and Families actually ran the workshops. I did not attend the workshops. We decided kind of together in the group, it was better if an outsider was not there, because some of these issues can be a little bit, maybe not controversial, a little bit a little bit too personal, and an outsider who is not a speaker of the language and who clearly is not from the community may skew a little bit the results. So I was not present during the workshops, and I'm feeling that from AFOC who ran the workshop. So acknowledgement and thank you for that as well. And then after this conversation, there was a break. There was a presentation in which that we prepared together, in which we, or rather she talked about linguistic assertiveness, our research on intercomprehension between Frisian and Dutch, and the negative effects that this accommodation had, or politeness. Back then, we were not using the term politeness that much, but it was about this. And then about 2 weeks later, that depending on a little bit on the participants, because this ended in May and some of them were on holiday, but about 2 weeks later, approximately, we got post-workshop surveys from the participants. So, and these post-workshops these post-workshop surveys, they had a lot of, the surveys in general had a lot of questions, both Likert scales and open-ended questions. We ended up only using the open-ended questions because we did not get enough participants with only 2 workshops to do anything with the Likert scales, anything meaningful. But the open-ended questions gave us a lot of insight, much more than we actually had expected. And so I'm actually recommending everyone to include at least one open-ended question in surveys, because otherwise these surveys would probably not have been useful. And so some of the results were, first, that we're satisfied with the workshop, which, I mean, this may not be a super meaningful result, but it is for us, because that means that, you know, this kind of works and we can do more of them, or you can do more of them. And so we have this here. I must say that even just being at the workshop has made me more determined to use Frisian. That an evening workshop really gets this from me, that is amazing. And so that's, you know, as researchers and activists that kind of designed this together, that was our goal, right? So we really loved hearing this. Of course, not everyone had the same reaction, but we did get through some of them. Actually, most of them were quite satisfied with the workshop, even if maybe that did not imply a change in their linguistic practices later on, but they were all satisfied with the workshop. We got also this idea of this fear of not being understood. So we asked about why you don't use your language, or why do you switch, and it was very common to have this come up, right? So in my opinion, it has to do with politeness. I do not want them to not be able to understand me. So this idea that they will not be able to understand me, even though the intercomprehension between Frisian and Dutch is actually quite high, and so they are likely to understand, or at least partially understand what you're saying. But there's also this quote kind of illustrates this link, this very ingrained and interiorized link that we have between comprehension equals, for us, accommodation, which equals politeness, right? So comprehension means that we, as speakers of minoritized languages, we have to accommodate, because that's being polite, right? That's being respectful towards the other person. Another quote similar, but this person is not very happy about it. It's quite sad. They said, still afraid that people would find it impolite, sorry. So this person in the post workshop survey said, okay, it was nice, but I'm still afraid that people will think it's impolite. So I'm sorry. And we wanted to emphasize that, well, actually, maybe people will think it's impolite, but this attitude changing, this accommodation, has extremely negative effects on the motivation of learners of minoritized languages, and it has been documented in several studies, several of them by O'Rourke in both Galician and Irish, and I think those mostly, but there's a couple of the languages that she has worked on. Also in the study that we conducted, and it's probably the studies that Kircher, Salinga are also conducting right now. There's also some mention of this. So this, this has a negative effect on learners. So we maybe want to stop that, or at least be aware of that, so that we can review its frequency. But of course, that doesn't mean that even if people think it's impolite, it doesn't mean that this doesn't happen. People don't use more than one language in everyday life, and they mix in conversation. It's quite often the case. We had some nice quotes here of people who did change their habits a little bit, and maybe even made some other people change their habits, right? So like this first here, yes, she says, Frisian is really very similar to Limburgish, so it's not difficult to me. It's maybe arguably not that similar to Limburgish, depending on how you do that. But that means that this person was used already to another variety. So maybe getting used to another Germanic variety was not as much of a hassle for this person. And then we got there's another one which is quite interesting. She says, it started because my Dutch-speaking housemates realized I kept speaking Frisian. So this person all of a sudden was like speaking more Frisian than usual. And then at one point, even they found themselves speaking Frisian, and they also had the intention to speak Frisian even more, right? So not only did this person change their linguistic habits and spoke more Frisian than before, but that made their Dutch-speaking housemates also use more Frisian. So as Soy Intentionist suggests, using your minoritized language by default, like the normal language that you use, can encourage speakers of Slavic language to try and learn it, or if they already know it, to try and speak it and practice it more often, even if it's unconscious, because if you use it more, they hear it more, and they may be more comfortable trying it out. But of course, not everyone was so happy about it, and there's also a very clear effects of accommodation of monolingual ideologies on the use of minoritized languages. Like having this quote, I find it more pleasant to speak the same language, which reduces the distance between interlocutors for me. I adapt to this and I feel more comfortable with it, which is perfectly fine. Of course, again, like accommodation is your decision, and if you feel more comfortable with it, that's on you. It just it's interesting, or it's important to sit down and make the effort to think whether you're actually more comfortable, whether it's actually your decision, or you're just doing it because you feel you have to. And that's the point, right? Like if it's your decision, go on. If you feel like you have to, maybe sit down and reconsider, and maybe you will still do it. But again, just like be a conscious decision if you do it or not. But of course, diglossia plays a huge role here, because even though the intercomprehension between Dutch and Frisian is very high, some people still think that you cannot use both in the same conversation, because that will prevent communication from happening, which would not be the case. But we also get, I wanted to finish with a couple of positive quotes. Again, we've got this, yeah, it makes the conversation just easier, right? The use in both languages makes it easier, which I really liked the contrast with the previous one. So the previous one said only one is easier, and this person says, no, it's good to use more than one, it makes it easier. I really like the contrast here. Again, every person is different. And here, this one here at the station in Yawad, I started in Frisian, and the woman at the coffee shop replied in Yawatis, which is also nice. And again, yeah, so conversations in mixed Frisian, Dutch builds Frisk, or any of the Germanic varieties in the region are actually common. People make these things all the time, and that's perfectly fine. They translanguage all the time. And these conversations are often very positive experiences anyway. So these things happen already. It's not like we introduced the idea of linguistic assertiveness, and we use the term, but not the idea of linguistic assertiveness in the place. It happens already, and translanguaging happens all the time, everywhere, and in Frisian, very, very, very commonly. And so some quick conclusions. Participants did agree on the usefulness of the workshops, which may be a little bit of a shallow conclusion, but it's good news for trying to do more of these. Fear of being understood is a major hurdle that speakers have from preventing them from using their language, which is largely documented in all minoritized languages, not just a Frisian thing. So we have to try and work on that. There is a clear belief that accommodation to dominant language equals politeness. So we think we're being respectful, but at the same time, this also has a very well-documented negative effect on those who want to learn the language. So we think we're being polite, but sometimes we're actually making things more difficult for them if they want to learn language. When intercomprehension is possible, like the case of Dutch and Frisian, accommodation is more about power than politeness, because accommodation is always to the dominant group, to the dominant variety, never the other way around. It's never expected the other way around. So if you don't accommodate to the dominant language, you are being impolite. But if you don't accommodate the minoritized language, that's fine. Nobody will say it's impolite. Nobody will even question it, which, you know, is at least curious. And accommodation does contribute to minorization. It contributes to the invisibilization of the language as well. And we have to acknowledge the agency of our interlocutors to ask for accommodation if necessary. So maybe not just go for it, but wait for them to ask. It's not our decision. Maybe they don't want us to accommodate because they want to learn the language, right? And at the same time, also, everyone needs to affirm their identity through their linguistic practices. So it's your decision whether you adapt or not. You may want to adapt because you want to communicate something that's necessary, or you may not want to adapt. And that's perfectly fine. It has to be your decision. And you should not feel like you have to because it's something that otherwise you're a bad person. No, you're entitled to decide how you use the linguistic repertoire that you have. Of course, again, there's nothing wrong about accommodating, but it's not something that you have to do by necessity and by default if you don't want to. And if we want to normalize the use of minoritized languages such as Frisian in society, especially in a global world like this one, in which they are living with surrounded by so many other languages, not just the dominant language that traditionally was in the area, but there's also English and so many other languages. We have to fight this line between accommodation and politeness, because otherwise people will not learn it. New people will not learn the language. People will maybe not even hear it. They will just not even know it's there, and we will use it less and less. And so speaking minoritized language is not impolite, of course, never. Like, just forget about it. Never. It doesn't really matter if the other person speaks it or not. It's not impolite. What is impolite is to expect that everyone has to adapt to your language, that you don't have to make any extra effort to communicate, which is not the case of minoritized speakers at all. And well, thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, you can send me an email. I wish I was there, really. I miss you all, and big thanks for your onda.